At 23, Carlos Alcaraz should be at the absolute peak of his powers. Instead, he's living through what tennis insiders are now calling a genuine crisis. And it's not just about a wrist. Yes, the injury is real. Yes, it's kept him off tour for months. But dig deeper into what's actually happened to Alcaraz's game this year, and a much bigger, much sadder story starts to emerge. Because it's not just that he got hurt, it's that the recovery process forced him to rebuild one of the most natural, instinctive parts of his entire game, his serve, from the ground up. And in doing that, something about the fearless, free-swinging player the world fell in love with may have quietly gotten lost along the way. Add to that the weight he's carried since childhood, a family that built his entire life around this sport, a country desperate for its next Nadal, and you start to understand why so many people close to the situation are describing this moment not as a simple injury story, but as something closer to a genuine reckoning. This is the tragedy of tennis's golden boy, not because his talent disappeared, but because the version of Carlos Alcaraz who made this sport must-watch television may not be walking back onto that court the same way he left it. To understand why this serve rebuild has become such a big deal behind the scenes, you have to understand what tennis insiders say actually happens when a player's wrist becomes compromised the way Alcaraz's has. The serve is arguably the single most wrist-dependent shot in the entire sport. It relies on a rapid, explosive snap of the wrist at the exact moment of contact, a motion that generates the racket head speed behind every big serve in professional tennis. For most players, that motion becomes so deeply ingrained through years of repetition that it happens entirely on instinct. No conscious thought, no hesitation, just pure muscle memory, refined since childhood. For Alcaraz, sources close to his camp have suggested that this exact motion is precisely what needed to be modified during his recovery. Protecting a compromised tendon sheath meant reducing the reliance on that natural wrist snap and replacing it with a more controlled, more mechanical service action, one that puts less strain on the injury but also strips away the instinctive freedom that made his original serve so dangerous in the first place. This is where the psychological toll really starts to show. Rebuilding a shot at the professional level isn't like adjusting a golf swing over an off-season. It means, for a period of time, a player has to consciously think through a motion that used to happen automatically. Every single serve becomes a mental checklist rather than a reflex. And for a player like Alcaraz, whose entire game has always been built on freedom, instinct, and fearless improvisation, that kind of conscious rebuilding can bleed into everything else he does on court. Coaches and biomechanics experts who study this kind of injury recovery describe it as one of the hardest transitions in professional sport, not because the new technique is necessarily worse, but because trusting it fully takes time that a player defending a Grand Slam title simply doesn't have. Alcaraz doesn't get the luxury of quietly testing his new serve in low-pressure exhibition matches for months. He has to trust it immediately, under the brightest lights in tennis, against opponents who have spent this entire year sharpening their own games while he was rebuilding his from scratch. And that's before you even factor in the mental noise surrounding all of this. A family that has invested everything in his career since he was 3 years old. A country that's treated him as the heir to Nadal's legacy since his teenage years. And now, on top of all that inherited pressure, a rebuilt serve he has to trust in real time, in front of a global audience expecting the same fearless champion who won the US Open just last year. So what does all of this actually mean heading into the rest of Alcaraz's season, and specifically the US Open? The uncomfortable truth is that a rebuilt serve doesn't just risk affecting one shot, it risks affecting his entire game plan. Alcaraz's tennis has always worked as a complete system. The serve setting up aggressive first strikes, the confidence from a reliable service game feeding into his willingness to take risks on return, at the net, on big points. If the serve itself is no longer something he can trust completely, that hesitation doesn't stay contained. It has a way of creeping into everything else. Watch for it in the small moments once he's back competing. Does he go for the corners on big points the way he used to? Or does he play it safer, more conservatively, protecting the shoulder and wrist rather than trusting the motion fully? Does his second serve, historically a weapon in its own right, still carry the same kick and depth? Or does it look tentative, more mechanical? These details will tell tennis analysts far more about where he really stands than his win-loss record in early rounds ever could. There's also a deeper concern being raised by people who've studied cases like this before. A rebuilt shot under this kind of pressure doesn't always fully return to its old form, even once the physical injury has completely healed. Sometimes the conscious rebuilding process leaves a permanent trace, a fraction of hesitation, a slightly different rhythm, something that never fully disappears back into pure instinct. If that happens to Alcaraz, even partially, the player who returns to the tour may simply be different from the one who left it. Not necessarily worse, but different, in ways that could take months or even years to fully understand. And then there's the part of this story that has nothing to do with biomechanics at all, the emotional weight of trying to defend a Grand Slam title, while working through all of this in public. Every match will be scrutinized. Every missed serve will be picked apart. Every hesitation will be framed as evidence of decline. For a 23-year-old who has never had the luxury of failing quietly, that kind of scrutiny, stacked on top of an already difficult physical and technical rebuild, is an enormous amount to carry into the most pressurized tournament of the year. So where does this leave Carlos Alcaraz? Not just as a player defending a Grand Slam title, but as the golden boy of tennis whose story was supposed to be a fairy tale of effortless dominance. Maybe this is simply a difficult chapter that resolves itself once his body fully catches up to where his instincts already are. A temporary rough patch in an otherwise limitless career, forgotten within a season once the rebuilt serve becomes second nature again. Champions have overcome technical rebuilds before, and come out the other side even stronger, more complete players than they were before the setback ever happened. But if the hesitation lingers, if the fearless, free-swinging player fans fell in love with doesn't fully return, if the rebuilt serve carries some permanent trace of caution even years down the line, this moment could end up being remembered very differently. Not as a temporary injury story, but as the exact point where the Golden Boy narrative quietly ran into reality. A reminder that even the most gifted, most fearless young champions the sport has ever produced are still human, still breakable, still capable of losing something in the process of trying to protect everything else. At 23, Carlos Alcaraz shouldn't be facing questions like this. He should be adding to his trophy case, cementing his legacy, enjoying the peak years every athlete dreams of reaching. Instead, he's fighting to rebuild the very foundation of his game, under a level of scrutiny most players never have to endure, carrying expectations that were placed on him before he was even old enough to understand them. That's the real tragedy here. Not that Carlos Alcaraz got injured. Athletes get injured all the time. The tragedy is that a 23-year-old who was supposed to be untouchable is now discovering, in the most public way imaginable, that even golden boys aren't invincible after all. That's the real story behind the wrist injury headlines. If this gave you a deeper look at what Alcaraz is really facing, hit subscribe. We dig into the stories other channels skip.